Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the introductions and thank you for those wonderful welcoming remarks. I think there's a wonderful link that I'm making between the Vice-Chancellor's comments about bravery in The Wizard of Oz and Professor Daniel Tam's comments about valiance. I think bravery is a fantastic topic to talk about with regards to e-learning before COVID, but especially after COVID. So many thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today and to share with you. And thanks to the Chinese University of Hong Kong for hosting and organising this event in partnership with Alpha. I think these events are so very important for our community to come together, to share ideas and build a better future for all of our learners and for our academics and for society and the community more broadly. And this year has certainly demonstrated the value and need for a strong global educational community. So let's get started. Today, I'm going to talk about strategy. Strategy to support our pedagogies. How we plan and how we think about digital learning platforms and practices and policy in a very, very complex world. So I'm going to describe the situation at the University of Queensland before COVID and during COVID. And I'm going to share the things that my colleagues and I are talking about, the things that we're curious about, the things we're interested in, and also the things that we're a little bit scared about. I'm going to suggest and explain what we're doing at the University of Queensland with regard to strategic agility. Essentially, my proposal is that we need a different mindset to deal with so much complexity and uncertainty in the face of such need for learning. What I'm arguing for is a change in culture, a change that I think better suits higher education and the academic identity. But before I do that, I really should introduce myself. So my job is, I'm the Deputy Director of Digital Learning at the University of Queensland, one of the top universities of Australia. I'm very proud to work at the University of Queensland. And my job is to coordinate the strategic conversation about digital learning strategy. And as you can see by my automatically generated LinkedIn profile, I'm very boring. And I think we've got a lot to do, a lot of work to do in the artificial intelligence space. Because I don't think I'm boring. I think I'm kind of interesting and I bring a lot of special skills to my role. So for example, I'm very, very easily distracted. And sometimes that's a problem. But in this job, being easily distracted means that I can find the good ideas, the surprises that exist outside of orthodox ways of doing things. And similarly, I'm a little bit immature. And this I think is good too, because it helps me see our work through the eyes of a student or even a new staff member. So you're probably asking, why is Greg starting the presentation like this? Well, I'll tell you. The reason is that our work is not really about technology at all. It's about people. And people are complicated and messy and curious, and they like to break the rules and they like to think about a better future. So this work, a digital learning strategy, is about how we connect people to each other and to our academic staff and to disciplines. It's not about the technology for its own sake. And I have to say, before COVID, I was much better looking, but you know, it's taken a huge toll on me. So before COVID, our work was already complicated. It was already volatile and uncertain and chaotic. And there was a tension that existed when we would think about the platforms that we wanted to procure, to support, to retire. So for example, a big tension, a big dilemma was between local academic teaching practice and macro institutional drivers. Every time we introduce a new application, we introduce more technical risk, more cognitive overload, and more demands on support and training. But all of our disciplines are different, and they all require different technological practices in order to really make the teaching of those disciplines come alive. We also have commercial issues. There are some very big technology providers like Microsoft, but there are many others, and their platforms, when used together, can provide a very beautiful, seamless experience for staff and students because there is very little friction. But once we're committed commercially to some of these big providers, it's very hard to disentangle. And in some ways, we're held hostage to their developments, to their changes in pricing. On the other hand, there are some amazing educational startups, and their ability to innovate is exemplary, but they can't provide the assurance and stability of service that we really need to rely on. There's other tensions too. With increasing costs being borne by students and their families, how do we navigate through expectations on quality and satisfaction with academic rigor? Students can and do, and sometimes should, fail. And I think one of the biggest problems that we're facing is academic change fatigue. We have a very real need to improve new platforms and practices, to change processes. And in fact, we have an expectation that people have to unlearn far more rapidly than in previous years. And we can't forget also that academic staff not only have to be across changes in digital pedagogies, but other technologies as well, new research opportunities, new administrative burdens, and business cases for new courses and programs. So academic workload and the explosion of administration is a very real tension that existed before COVID. And along comes COVID. I am so sick of COVID. I'm sick of being sick about COVID. As we all know, COVID meant that for the safety of our staff and students, we couldn't all come to campus. Digital learning became the new necessity. It was not a novelty anymore. And at the University of Queensland, like every institution, I think, over a few short weeks, we transformed most of our courses and degrees to be taught online. It was a huge effort. It put enormous pressure on staff and students and continues to do so. During this process of moving 517 courses to 2,689 courses, we knew that we would find wicked problems. Problems that we could predict that we didn't know the answer to. And of course, we are still enduring and wrestling with those bumps today. So let me share with you some of the wicked problems that we've encountered. So it's already been remarked in by our wonderful welcoming speakers. Students' digital literacy is one of the biggest issues that we've found. And furthermore, students' motivation and self-regulation have been critical determinants of success in this new environment. Same for our academic staff. All of a sudden, they had to work from home and work online with all of their added pressures of family and the containment and health concerns and stress. Many teachers had to very rapidly change teaching mode, very high demands on professional staff. And we realised too that internet connectivity is the absolute foundation of a quality experience, and it's not all the same. Every given location has different internet speeds. Every different individual has a different internet service provider. And that was an incredibly traumatic experience for a number of staff and students. We had to roll out new capabilities, new technologies incredibly rapidly. Transcription of lectures, online invigilation of exams. And we also saw that many of the library resources that we relied on, the software licenses didn't support this new mode of experience. Now, as restrictions relaxed, we had to consider how to teach students in class and at home at the same time. And our physical and digital infrastructure just couldn't accommodate that. Similarly, assessment has proved to be one of the biggest challenges. Our policy, our platforms and practices needed to change very rapidly. And I think many ethical dilemmas began to emerge, specifically how we can help maintain student privacy, student data privacy, as well as ensure examination security and we've had a lot of attention on that in Australia. Similarly, Australia has a very large cohort of international students, and all of a sudden they couldn't come to Australia or couldn't return to their home countries, but they were still enrolled and studying, which meant we needed to support students who were all in very different legislative and regulatory environments. Now, I think, as everybody knows, it's been an exhausting time, but I have to say I'm very, very proud of what our international community did to share approaches and to continue to provide education during the pandemic. It's completely reframed the conversation. And it's also become clear, certainly to me, our students love the campus. They might not love coming for a lecture. They might not like traveling 2 hours to not find a park, but they certainly love the physical space for all of that social and informal learning that a physical campus does so very, very well. Interestingly too, they also love parts of the experience during COVID. They love the resources that were developed. They love the flexibility. So we now, as an international community, have to ask ourselves, what are the new student expectations? Are we ready for it? How will this transform our understanding of the physical campus and the digital campus? Now, I think one interesting way to think about this is to talk about it in terms of teaching modes. Now, on that top traditional row, I think we have a lot of experience in this mode of interaction. Our pedagogical research provides a lot of guidance on active classroom, timetabled experience. And I think, we also know a lot about these special events. We know about intensives and boot camps and workshops and capstones. Work integrated learning is also something that we have done quite a bit of research into, as well as our understanding of these informal learning spaces. Now, in the blended row, I think we have an emerging understanding about how this works across the disciplines. And I'm still impressed with Twig's work back in 2006 on the notion of there are different metaphors to design. The notion that a blended learning experience can supplement the face-to-face environment, can completely replace elements of the face-to-face environment, or become completely personalised for each individual student depending on their learning needs and preferences. Similarly, we've had some experience as a community with wholly online, but I think this is still an exception. These are the people who have jumped in, usually enthusiasts to work with MOOC providers like edX, like Coursera, and they've had a fantastic experience in looking at the impact on learners from self-paced, instructor-led, massive and bicronus modes. So clearly there are significant challenges when you look at the technologies to support all of these different ways that we interact with our students and they interact with each other. This is something that my colleagues and I are also talking about, these emerging modes. So HighFlex from the University of San Francisco, I think is very exciting, but I'll be honest, it is terrifying. The idea that a student can choose any given week to engage with academics and each other face-to-face synchronously, online synchronously, or asynchronously, I think is very compelling from a pedagogical point of view, but a logistical nightmare. How do you timetable something like this? And the pedagogical challenge of every week designing a configuration of assessment activities and technologies to get parity with learning outcomes. And yet it is still compelling. My colleagues and I are also talking about dual mode, the physical and virtual infrastructure that we don't really have that allows us to join face-to-face groups with a cohort of students who are all studying from home or studying from their workplace all together. So how can we possibly work in this space? What's the infrastructure to provide that kind of complete flexibility? There are technologies out there. but are they in most universities? I would argue not. To make strategic planning even more difficult, we need to look beyond the higher education sector. And I think this is incredibly important because in higher ed, we can sometimes have a bit of tunnel vision, only looking at the student information systems and learning management systems that we're familiar with. But there are a range of technologies in other sectors that we need to monitor and to consider in our curriculum. And the workload to do this is staggering. Every specific technology that we consider, we need to consider how this could feature in a student journey, in a student experience of our curriculum. How does it feature with academics in their course design? What do we need to do prior to delivery and after to evaluate it? What are the relationships between every specific technology and learning activities, learning outcomes, assessment, and people? So my point here is simply the proliferation of technologies is so great that to do a systematic evaluation is incredibly difficult from a workload point of view. Now, one thing that we're considering in Australia investing a lot more attention toward is this notion of micro-credentials. And essentially, these are targeted at people already in the workplace, short experiences that are academically rigorous, that focus on upskilling or reskilling or cross-skilling. Essentially, they're what we're doing already, but smaller, and a lot of them are online. But there are other disruptions, I would argue, that our sector needs to be very curious about. For example, we need to explore how the university operating model could change. A good example of that for me is, what if the barriers to entry to become a university all of a sudden were lowered? And we could have, for example, one academic and 20 students and they're a university. How would that change our choices about digital technology? How would that change our approaches about how knowledge is created and disseminated? Similarly, there's some conceptual opportunities for disruption. So a good example of that is, historically, we've thought about technology as a transaction partner, a delivery mechanism. But there are other ways to think about it. For example, what if every one of our students graduated with their own designed digital assistant and avatar? Moving beyond technology and organisation, we also have other disruptions that are available to us as well. Our relationship with the world of work. Now, many students, certainly in Australia, take a gap year between graduating high school and moving on to university. And it's very easy to imagine a series of gap years that the university curates and creates as a completely personalised experiences. And this has an impact on how we think about graduate attributes. What if we focus much more on notions of leisure and pleasure and play? What if our graduate attributes are focused less on specialisation and more on breadth, much like the universities in Germany 80, 90 years ago? So all of these different disruptions to our model remind me that in many ways we're not in competition with other universities. We're in competition with completely different ways of being, like some of the companies that we're seeing with Netflix. We're seeing other Amazon. We're seeing other ways that people can access learning. So these are some of the things that my colleagues and I are talking about, and we're very curious about, and we're also a little bit scared about. And the notion that technology and that people are living longer and healthier lives is something that underpins some of our curiosities. Now, this situation that we're in reminds me of what's known as the Icarus Paradox. And the Icarus Paradox is the idea that the things that made us successful today are the exact same things that might make us fail tomorrow. Things change profoundly. And there is a warning here, is that our processes can become routines. Our resources become obstacles, our relationships become chains, and our values become dogmas. So I've been working in this field for over 25 years. And most often, the response to these challenges involves a plea, a beg for simplicity. Let's reduce the platforms and technologies. Let's simplify the processes. Let's reduce the noise. And I think that is completely understandable. I completely understand this. Have we ever achieved this? No. I can't even imagine a situation whereby when we simplify one element, another complexity just seems to come up. I don't think it's possible. I think what we need is a new way of doing strategy at the university, new ways to think about change. And I think this is a cultural opportunity, much more than a technical opportunity. So what I propose is that we drop this notion that simplicity is the light on the hill. And I propose that we draw upon adaptive leadership theory to provide some guidance on how we do digital learning in the university sector. So in this way of thinking, the goal is not to reduce complexity, but to use it, to avoid easy and often wrong solutions that are only very temporary. In this model of thinking, the aim is to meet complexity with complexity and to become much more comfortable as a community in staying in that middle area where things seem chaotic and complex, and to identify opportunities to amplify a certain kind of conflict, a certain kind of connection, and thereby look for opportunities to reintegrate either in an entrepreneurial innovation space or in an operational space. Now, this is not easy, and many of my colleagues may disagree. This is not a feel-good leadership style. It does mean committing to conflict. It means forcing connections. It means not knowing that the right answer, or not knowing what the right answer is for extended periods of time. It also means doing many things simultaneously, improving operational quality and innovating at the same time. So what this means is a cultural shift that involves tension, creativity, and uncertainty, and maybe some stress. So what does this look like on the ground? So it means a new way of organising our work, an organising structure that is much more fluid, that has shifting representation and membership, that needs to have oversight over production and service quality and innovation at the same time. It also means a need to allow for technology and capability overlaps to exist and collide, and to simply wait to see what wins, what emerges. It's also practicing our ability and our willingness to rapidly unlearn and to be comfortable when we are faced with a complex situation of introducing more complexity and seeing what emerges. This strategy is not for everyone, that's for sure. So at the University of Queensland, we've adopted this philosophy of adaptive leadership, and the Digital Learning Steering Committee, of which I'm a member, for the last year and a half has been working through these elements to produce a 3-horizon strategy with 3 core aims. In that first horizon that we're concentrating on now is quite simply to improve our digital learning foundation. So this keeps structures the same and introduces new capabilities and retires old ones. I'll talk about that in a little bit more depth soon. Horizon 2 is a much more systematic approach to innovation. How do we discover and select the local technologies and practices that we think are worthwhile in investigating? And Horizon 3 is about parity, how we move towards much greater use of technologies that already exist in the community and in industry. So just to dive in very quickly, and you can already see how this, I hope, helps enact what an adaptive learning strategy looks like. So in that first horizon, we have a number of capabilities. We want to minimize administration and business processes. We want to improve the data integration between our systems. We want to improve the agency of our academics to produce new learner interfaces and experiences, faster, better use of mobile devices, introducing learning analytics and assessment technologies. In that second horizon, we've committed to a student-led process that involves designing, piloting, and centrally supporting discipline-specific applications. And in one of the slides I showed earlier, the encouragement for these students is to reach out to industry and the community and the academics to be able to together go through a process of prioritizing those technologies outside of the sector that we think we should be investigating, not just innovation that improves service quality. And that work has just commenced. Now, this third horizon is probably in some ways the most important. We have active use of social media and other platforms that you see with Google, with Microsoft and others. And the question is, why aren't we using them more in our teaching if this is exactly the experiences that they will need for our students when they graduate or when they move to a different place? So this is about parity with industry. So I'm not sure where I am on time. I'm pretty sure that I've come to the end, but I'd like to thank you all for your time to listen to our reflections at the University of Queensland and what we're doing about it. And I'm very happy to hear any comments or any questions, challenges or enthusiasms. But if you don't get the time, I'm more than happy for you to connect with me via email or LinkedIn or other platforms, and we can continue the conversation that way. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. WINSLETT, for the inspiring sharing and sharing a lot with us on the digital learning landscape. And we now have time for a couple of questions from the floor. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box in Zoom, and some questions will be picked for Dr. WINSLETT. While we wait for your questions, do our officiating guests have any questions about the sharing? Please unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you for the great sharing. So it's Paul M. Hi, I'm just wondering, you are in your talk, you anticipate a lot of changes are going to happen. And on the technology side, do you think there is a gap still for what you want to do and what technology is going to provide? Can you highlight a few of these gaps and what the technology people can try to, the direction for them, what they can do in order to get to the changes you talk about?
It's a very good question, Paul. There's a number of, I think, pain points that come to mind. One of them is the data integration, and that's at the back end. So a lot of the work that our students are doing in these different platforms doesn't flow across, which retards our ability to create meaningful learning analytics for students and academics. So that's the back end data pain point. And a part of the problem is that we have many third-party suppliers who don't provide us with the data in the structures and in the timing we want. So that's the first pain point. And that's about us working with these providers to have better relationships, I think. So that's one bit. The other bit is that if we commit to a next generation learning management system, which is about a whole collection of technologies, then we still have learner experience friction at the front end. And so this is all about where the buttons are and where the links are and ways that we can configure an experience that doesn't require training, that doesn't require that kind of work. So those are the two, those are integration issues that I think we're working through. The other, I think, very strong pain point is the collaboration and communication platform issue. And there are so many different ways in the marketplace in which we can support students to have very specific collaboration opportunities. But, and I hope you'll forgive the metaphor, it reminds me of my kitchen. In my kitchen, I have a bunch of single ingredient appliances. I have an appliance that can do one thing, and I understand, and it does that one thing very well. And we have an academic culture and identity that wants to make its own choices. So that for me is part of the tension. It's very hard to buy and support all of these different specific technologies. And sometimes it creates a big disconnect for students. But pedagogically, in that moment, they're fantastic. And I think the third issue for me is all about the technologies that we're not using. So for example, I love Blackboard. I love a lot of different learning management systems, but the reality is that you don't use them outside of university. You know, there are other platforms, in the Internet of Things and engineering, certainly in the community in Australia, most of our companies are either Google or Microsoft. So we should consider, at least ask the question, why aren't we using them more? Yeah. I hope that answered your question.
Dr. Winslett, we now have a question in our Q&A Zoom box. And one of our audience would like to know, ODL, Open and Distance Learning, existed without mobile devices or internet before. Are there any lessons learned from there rather than limited to only via digital medium?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't quite catch the question.
ODL existed without mobile devices or internet before. So any lessons learned from there rather than limited?
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, it's a good question. I think the university sector needs to reconsider how we support students in either the selection or the provisioning of internet service plans and devices. So one of the big challenges that we found, certainly during our assessment period, is that students who had to take online invigilated exams, for example, didn't have the internet connectivity, didn't have the right device, and this became a real issue for social equity. And I think in the past, universities have given that responsibility to students, saying, look, if you want to study it with us, you need to take care of these different parts of that experience. And I think we need to rethink that. I think we need to start thinking about how we can leverage scholarships and philanthropy and maybe other financial instruments to help students not only have the appropriate devices, but the appropriate support, the appropriate connections to do it. This will become even more important when we will defeat COVID and our students return to campus, and they will have these new expectations that are going to happen with digital devices here. That's the notion of the smart campus. Yeah.
May I ask a question? Hi, Greg. Thanks for the very interesting, really inspiring talk. Just, I'm actually very interested when you said the leadership these days, the new leadership has to be more complex and really ride on this complexity, have more conflict and talk about things and everything. But isn't it, this is exactly what have happened with COVID that actually led us to this situation now. I mean, we didn't invent COVID, of course, but there's all the conflict, all the discussion, everybody has their own idea how to deal with it. It was actually leading to the world being completely out of control. So now you're actually trying to duplicate that in the university? Sorry, I like to be provocative in these cases. So how can we manage that?
Well, I guess, thank you. That's a really good, I certainly welcome that kind of challenge, Eva. Fantastic, because that's my point, is that in my experience, I think that the university has always been like that to a degree. I don't actually think that before COVID, certainly my experience is that, has been that different. There's always been that very productive competition of ideas, certainly that whole freedom that academics have to have their own research agendas, their own teaching approaches, their own ways of creating the experience. It's like a bunch of small business owners all together who they're only united by their interest in parking. So I would put forward the idea that it's actually not that different. It's been amplified under COVID, and I think it's not necessarily something we need to try and diminish, but maybe something we need to amplify, because it is that academic competition of ideas. It doesn't feel good. I know that.
Thanks.
I realized that Professor Owen King has also left his questions in the Q&A box. He's saying that he really liked the chart on different universities, example like the micro college, think tank, the University of Beauty, etc. However, with this proliferation of different ways to learn, it's also challenging on accreditation to ensure the quality of education is maintained.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think I'm very curious in Australia what we're doing to decouple short form credentials or micro credentials from what we're calling continuing professional education. And we do offer digital badges, okay, to say, and that essentially is a University of Queensland digital badge to say you experienced this. It does not come with assessment. It doesn't come with accreditation, and you can't stack it, combine it to create a program or a course or a degree. But I think there's a lot of business development. There's a lot of quality work that still needs to be developed to make sure that any kind of university experience, even if it's not credentialed, has sufficient quality to be part of that offering. So I offer those models as conceptual kind of inspirations. These are things that we can think of how we might want to investigate changes to our curriculum, but we don't necessarily need to go there.
Thank you, Professor Dr. WINSLETT, excuse me. Yes, and one of our audience would like to know, could you share some of the successful dual mode teaching setup that are effective for both lecturers and students' learning experiences?
It's something that I think is very risky. I believe that we have tried a number of dual mode experiences, and we've encountered some of the baseline technical problems that you would anticipate, sound and microphones. So if you've got a classroom filled with students who have Zoom on, it creates a lot of echo. You've got issues with lighting. Now, that being said, I do know that there are providers out there, I won't name them, who are selling physical and virtual infrastructure that allows for these groups to come together. So once we've solved some of those technical baseline quality issues, then I think we can start to look at the learning design activity heuristics or learning design patterns that effectively manage that environment for each of our disciplines. But we're not there yet, because at the moment, all we're doing is classroom management. And this is the problem. I used to teach via video conferencing when I lived in Japan. And very quickly I learned, if it takes 5 minutes to set up an activity that only has 1 minute of value, don't do the activity.
Sure, I think I would definitely get it. One of our audience would also, he mentioned that in his country, there's challenges in the internet connectivity.
Yeah.
So is there a problem in terms of connectivity in your country, and how did your university manage the delay of submission or connectivity with your students?
Well, I don't think we've resolved it 100%. There were a number of tactics we used, and there is enormous differences in Australia with internet connectivity, and some of our students have no internet connectivity. So it was a huge issue. So there was a number of things that we did. One of them is creating an experience that had flexibility for students. We didn't demand that they connect at particular times, creating a lot of high quality, low bandwidth resources. So these are pedagogically robust and engaging experiences, but not huge file sizes. So that was part of what we did. We also had a scholarship scheme to provide those students with money for devices and internet service providers, but that wasn't always possible. But I genuinely think we haven't resolved this issue, and we're still wrestling with that.
Yeah, I'm sure that's definitely great challenges in every part of the world. So one of our audience would also like to know that about the overarching context of the possibility of the learning quality. That is, how do you encourage the different sectors of the university community to move towards a desired change of mindset?
Oh, if I knew the answer to that, I think I would be in a much more positive place. Because as you know, like many of us in this space, we're not telling people what to do. We're providing principles, we're providing research and resources. It's not really possible for us to say things like, you have to teach 3 Zoom lessons a week. You know, it's not that culture, it's not that environment. So what we are promoting, and certainly what I'm promoting, is as much connection and productive conflict as possible. So that means that certainly our learning designers, our higher education academics, our role is conversation. Our role is at elbow support. And so we need to be highly hyper-connected with our community, and we need to be very resilient, because we have an academic workforce who is exhausted. They do not want any new technologies. They don't want any new things. They just want to be left alone. So as a core service, we need to be connected, but very empathetic. We need to be active listeners.
Thank you for the answer. And one of our audiences also would like to know that how can we overcome the resistance towards change, especially towards using digital platforms from staff? Can you also share your experience of privacy protection when we encourage students to create audio or visual assignments and share them on online platforms?
Sure, I'll treat them as 2 different questions, but they're very related. I see the link. All right, in terms of incentivizing, there are a number of levers that we can pull to help people come. Now, at the very lowest level is we can provide infrastructure. We can provide technologies, we can provide resources. Similarly, we can provide training and support. The third thing that we can do is provide rewards and recognition. So this helps describe the kinds of practices and behaviours that we valorize, that we think are valuable. The fourth one, and the scariest one, is policy. And that is when we say you have to do X, Y, and Z. So those are the levers to help bring about change. Now, my personal interest area, and in fact my PhD thesis was about this specifically, is that resistance is innovation. So when we come across people who are resisting, it's those people we need to tackle first, not last. So that's my personal sort of sociological perspective. I think that we've been doing innovation a bit wrong. I think we need to focus on the people who most loudly say no, and we do that first, not at the end. Now, the other question, the experience of privacy and examinations. Look, that has been so very, very difficult. Students understandably are concerned about third-party providers accessing their computers to do examination invigilation. They're very concerned about showing where they are. You know, it's their private home, and some students, you know, their living conditions, they have shared houses. They don't want to share that with somebody that they don't know. And yet we do know that until we completely transform our assessment, which isn't always possible, then we have to rely on examinations. And sadly, we have to acknowledge that some students will ask somebody else to do the exam for, or they will collaborate together. And where we landed is we understood these concerns about privacy, but we don't want to produce degrees that become less in value because of these small amounts of students who might choose to act without integrity. But is it a dilemma? Absolutely. And we are trying to, over the next little while, to transform our assessment to minimise the need for online invigilation. So I'm very hopeful.
Thank you, Dr. Winslett. And that brings an end to the Q&A section. I'm sure all of us find it really rewarding. Thank you, Dr. Winslett.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.